The briefing they gave me before I left Vethkalos Prime was 37 pages long. I read all of it twice, and I remember thinking, sitting in that sterile observation room with its recycled air and humming fluorescent panels, that 37 pages was more than enough to understand a species, more than enough to understand how they fought, how they organized, how they moved across a battlefield. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything. My name is Sale Doran. I'm a tactical analyst for the Collective Strategic Assessment Bureau, which is a long title for a job that basically means this. When the collective wants to understand how another civilization wages war, they send someone like me to watch, to document, to come home and write a report that helps the High Council decide whether a species is a threat, an asset, or something in between. I had been doing this for 11 years by the time they assigned me to the Human Assessment Project. 11 years. I had watched the Curvath swarm tactics on Melindra IV. I had observed the Dreeth hive-mind coordination on 3 separate contested systems. I had sat in the observation galleries above Grethian war games and cataloged their predictive strike patterns until I could anticipate their maneuvers before their own commanders called them. I was, by any reasonable measure, very good at my job. The Curvath had taken me a week to understand. The Dreeth maybe 2 weeks. The Grethians, who are genuinely frightening in a clinical, mechanical way, took me about 3 weeks before I felt I had a comprehensive picture. I was allocated 45 standard cycles on Earth. The Council thought that was generous. I thought it was probably excessive. We were both wrong, but in opposite directions. I arrived at the human installation they call Fort Blackridge on a morning, in what they call early autumn. Autumn, that word. I had read it in the briefing documents, a seasonal cycle in which their world tilts slightly on its axis, and the vegetation responds by changing color before dying. The briefing described it clinically, the way briefing documents always do, something about photosynthesis and chlorophyll degradation. What the briefing document did not prepare me for was the smell of it. I stepped out of the transport vehicle, which the humans call a Humvee, a word I found endearing in its bluntness, and the air hit me, and it was nothing like recycled air. It was cool and layered. There was something in it, something almost sweet but not quite, something that my translator chip flagged as decomposing organic matter, but that my lungs, my Vethi lungs, which evolved on a world that has no autumn, decided was wonderful. The trees around the base were doing something I had only seen in images. Some of them were yellow. Some were a deep red-orange that I genuinely had no color reference for in my native visual vocabulary. They stood along the perimeter fence of Fort Blackridge, and they were absolutely, completely, distractingly beautiful. The soldier who had been assigned to escort me, a sergeant first class named Marcus Webb, watched me staring at the trees for a moment and then said, "First time seeing fall." "Yes," I said. "It's nice," he said. Then he picked up my equipment case and walked toward the main gate, and I followed him, and I thought, this is going to be a strange 45 cycles. I had no idea. Fort Blackridge was a training installation. That was the arrangement the collective had worked out with the human governments. I would observe training exercises, not active deployments. I would be given access to tactical simulations, live fire drills, coordination exercises. I would be treated as something between a guest and a curiosity. The humans knew what I was there for. The arrangement was officially described as a mutual cultural exchange, but everyone on both sides understood that what I was doing was studying them, assessing them. The human officers were professionally courteous about this. A few of them were visibly uncomfortable. One colonel, a short woman named Castillo, who wore her gray hair cropped so close it was almost invisible, looked at me across the briefing table on my first day and said, very directly, "You're here to figure out if we're dangerous." "I'm here to understand your tactical doctrine," I said. She smiled. It was not a warm smile. "That's a yes." I respected her immediately. The first 2 weeks were, frankly, impressive but not surprising. The humans were good soldiers, disciplined in a way that was interesting, not the hive discipline of the Dreeth, not the algorithmic precision of the Grethians, but something messier and somehow more robust. They argued with each other during after-action reviews. I watched junior soldiers push back on their officers' tactical assessments, not with insubordination but with genuine analytical challenge, and I watched officers respond not with authority but with counter-argument. It was chaotic. It was inefficient. And somewhere in that inefficiency, there was something that kept producing correct answers in ways I couldn't entirely explain. Their physical capabilities I had read about but still found remarkable to observe in person. The endurance in particular. I watched a unit run what they called a 12-mile ruck, carrying full combat equipment over uneven terrain, and then be expected to engage in a tactical exercise immediately at the end of it. The Curvath would have required a recovery period. The Dreeth don't tire the same way, but they also don't adapt. You break their rhythm and they lose coherence. The humans finished the run, breathing hard, sweat soaking through their uniforms in a way that is physiologically bizarre to a Vethai observer, and then they just reset, like a switch. Like they had some internal system that could look at a situation and say, yes, this is terrible, and we are doing it anyway. I wrote extensive notes. I ate the food in the mess hall, which the soldiers seemed to find endlessly amusing. I tried something called a protein bar on my 4th day and described it in my notes as dense, sweet-adjacent, and aggressively optimistic about what constitutes nutrition. I also tried coffee, which I have complicated feelings about. My translator chip flagged the bitterness as a warning signal, a biological response that says this substance is potentially toxic. My higher cognitive functions noted that every human in the building was consuming it willingly, and several of them had told me they couldn't function without it. I wrote 3 pages of notes about coffee alone. Sergeant Webb, who had been assigned as my permanent escort and liaison, found this very funny. He was a quiet man, taller than average for a human, with a face that had the particular stillness of someone who has spent a long time paying attention to the wrong places at the right moments. He had done 3 deployments in what the humans call active combat zones. He rarely talked about this. But sometimes, when I asked him a question about something I had observed, a decision a unit had made, a tactical choice that seemed counterintuitive, he would answer in a way that had the specific weight of personal experience rather than academic knowledge. Why did the squad leader pull the unit back before confirming the threat? I asked him once, after observing an exercise. He thought about it for a second. Because he'd lost 2 guys before from confirming threats. That's not in the tactical doctrine manual. No, he said, it's not. I wrote that down too. It was in my 3rd week at Fort Blackridge that Colonel Castillo called me into her office and told me about the exercise. I want to be precise about how this was presented to me because I have replayed the conversation many times since and I think the framing matters. She didn't describe it as anything extraordinary. She sat behind her desk with a cup of coffee and a stack of actual paper documents. Humans still use paper for certain things, which I found charming, and she said, "We have a joint exercise scheduled for the 19th. Multi-unit, combined arms, night scenario. You'll have access to the observation tower and real-time comms." "What's the scenario?" I asked. "Defense against a simulated superior force," she said. 3-to-1 numerical disadvantage, partial terrain advantage for the defending unit, standard attrition win conditions. I noted this down. A 3-to-1 numerical disadvantage was a standard enough training scenario. The Grethians run similar drills. The interesting variable was partial terrain advantage. Humans, I had noticed, were very good at using terrain in ways that their numerical disadvantage didn't predict. "What's the attacking force?" I asked. She smiled that same not-warm smile. "You'll see. I want to stop here and explain something." In 11 years of tactical assessment, I had developed a kind of professional equanimity. You develop it or you burn out. You can't go through life watching civilizations practice killing each other and bring raw emotional engagement to every observation. You learn to watch with a certain clinical distance. You note the effective tactics. You categorize the threat level. You write the report. I had not cried at work since my 2nd year. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that what happened on the 19th was not something I was emotionally prepared for. Not because I was unprepared professionally. I was prepared professionally. I had read everything they gave me. I had spent 3 weeks watching these humans train. I thought I understood what I was going to see. What I did not understand, what the 37 pages did not cover, what 11 years of professional distance did not inoculate me against, was the specific, unrepeatable feeling of watching something that redefines what you thought was possible. That feeling is not something you can prepare for. The 19th fell on a Tuesday, which is what the humans call the third day of their weekly cycle. It was colder than the days before. The trees had lost more of their color overnight. There had been wind, and many of the orange-red leaves had come down in the night and lay across the training grounds in drifts. I arrived at the observation tower at 300. That's what they call it, 0300, a way of saying 3 in the morning. The sky was still fully dark. The training complex was a large area of mixed terrain, a section of open ground, a forested corridor, a series of constructed structures that simulated a small settlement, and beyond that, a ridge line with multiple approach angles. Sergeant Webb arrived at 3:10 with coffee. He handed me a cup without asking. I had stopped refusing coffee around day 10. "You ready?" he asked. "I am always ready," I said. He made a small sound. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was something more complicated. I looked out from the tower. Below in the darkness, I could just make out movement, the defending unit taking their positions. I had studied their composition during the pre-exercise briefing. Echo Company, 212 soldiers, a mix of infantry, light armor support, and an engineering element. Their defensive position was centered on the constructed settlement, with outpost lines extending into the forest corridor. 212. The attacking force, I had been told, was 608. What I had not been told, what Colonel Castillo had declined to tell me with that particular smile, was the nature of the attacking force. I found out at 3:47. I was scanning the approach with a thermal viewer when Sergeant Webb, standing beside me, said quietly, "Here they come." I looked, and for a moment, I want to be honest about this, I thought the thermal viewer was malfunctioning. The heat signatures coming over the ridgeline were wrong. They were the right rough shape for bipedal combatants, but the thermal profile was off. Too consistent, too regular, and the movement pattern was wrong in a way I couldn't immediately classify, no variance in stride, no breath clouds in the cold air, no thermal bloom from exertion. "Sergeant Webb," I said slowly, "what is that?" "Grethian pattern combat drones," he said. "Loaned to the exercise by the collective's own assessment program, about 600 of them, the attacking force." I turned to look at him. He was watching the ridge line with an expression I couldn't read. "The attacking force," I said carefully, "is 600 Grethian combat drones." "Yep." I turned back to the thermal viewer. 600 Grethian pattern combat drones. I had spent 3 weeks studying Grethian tactical doctrine. I had watched Grethian combat units in live exercises and cataloged their capabilities with professional thoroughness. Grethian drones operate in network-coordinated swarms with algorithmic target prioritization, distributed sensor arrays, adaptive formation protocols, and fire suppression systems calibrated to neutralize targets with approximately 91% efficiency in open-terrain engagement. They are, by any reasonable tactical assessment, terrifying. Against an entrenched human force of 212, a 3-to-1 numerical advantage of Grethian pattern combat drones should have produced a predictable result. The collective's own tactical models, I had access to these models, I had run scenarios on them myself, predicted an Echo Company defensive collapse within 45 to 60 minutes. Significant simulated casualties, possible total attrition. "How long has Echo Company been preparing for this scenario?" I asked. "About 3 weeks, Webb said. "Same as you've been here." "They've been training for," I stopped. "They knew they were going to face Grethian pattern drones." "They knew they were going to face something they'd never faced before," he said. "They didn't know exactly what." I looked at him. "The Colonel's idea," he said. "She wanted your assessment to be of something real, not a demonstration." The exercise began at 400 exactly. 600 Grethian pattern drones came over the ridge line in standard Grethian engagement formation, the dispersed wedge pattern that maximizes coverage while maintaining networked coherence. It's an elegant formation. I had written extensively about how well it works against both static and mobile defensive positions. For the first 3 minutes, nothing happened. The drones advanced. They moved through the outer perimeter of the defended position. Their sensors swept the terrain in the overlapping grid pattern that Grethian targeting systems use to eliminate coverage gaps. The advance was measured, coordinated, silent in the way that machines are silent. not quiet exactly, but with a quality of sound that has no irregularity to it. No breath, no footfall variation, just the constant mechanical undertone of 600 units in synchronized motion. I was watching the defensive positions through the thermal viewer, and I noticed something. Echo Company wasn't moving. Not retreating, not repositioning, not engaging. Nothing. The drones swept through the outer perimeter structures, cleared the forward outpost positions, and found them empty. They recalibrated. The formation adjusted standard Grethian response to a vacated defensive line, shift to pursuit and contain protocol, begin scanning for secondary defensive emplacements. "Where are they?" I asked. Webb said nothing. The drones moved deeper into the settlement structure. Their thermal scans were covering every building, every alley, every potential concealment point. 3 minutes became 5. 5 became 8. The drone formation had moved 300 meters into the defensive zone without contact. And then I saw it. On my thermal viewer at the very edge of the display, something shifted. A shape that had been perfectly still, so perfectly still that even the thermal viewer had categorized it as part of the environment, moved. Just slightly, just enough. And then another and another. They had been there the entire time. Spread through the settlement in positions that were, I'm going to try to explain this as precisely as I can, positions that were not where Grethian sensors would look. Not behind obvious cover. Not in predictable firing positions. In drainage channels. In the gaps between building structures. In the collapsed section of a roof where the thermal signature blended with the heat profile of the surrounding materials. Someone had studied the Grethian sensor sweep pattern. Someone had done the math on exactly where the coverage gaps were. And they had put their 212 people in those gaps. The next 4 minutes are, in my professional experience and personal memory, the most extraordinary 4 minutes of continuous tactical observation I have ever witnessed. I want to describe them carefully, because I know how they sound when I try to summarize them. I know the summary sounds impossible. I am asking you to trust that I was there, watching through a calibrated thermal viewer with real-time sensor telemetry from the exercise controllers, and every second of what I am about to describe was confirmed by multiple independent recording systems. At the 8-minute mark, Echo Company made contact. It didn't begin with gunfire. That was the first thing that surprised me. In every defensive doctrine I had ever studied, when an entrenched force makes contact with an advancing enemy, they shoot. You establish a fire line. You create suppression. You slow the advance. Basic tactical logic across a dozen civilizations. Echo Company didn't shoot first. What they did first was cut the network. I didn't understand this for about 30 seconds. I saw a section of the drone formation, maybe 40 units in the northeast quadrant, suddenly change behavior. Their movement became erratic. Their formation coherence degraded. They began scanning in conflicting directions, their targeting systems receiving contradictory inputs. "What just happened?" I said. "EMP pulse," Webb said. "Low-yield directional, enough to knock out the local network node without flagging the broader swarm." I stared at him. "They mapped the drone network architecture," he said, simply, like this was obvious. "In 3 weeks," I said. "In about 10 days, actually. They spent the other 11 days figuring out how to use it. The Grethian tactical models, the models I used, the models the collective's own Strategic Assessment Bureau had used for 30 years, do not account for a scenario in which the opposing force has correctly mapped the network architecture of a Grethian drone swarm and identified surgical disruption points. Because no one had ever done that before. What happened after the network disruption I can only describe as, and I know how this sounds, beautiful, in a terrible, devastating, absolutely precise way. The northeast quadrant of the drone formation lost coherence. 40 units went into independent scan mode, which in a Grethian system means they begin prioritizing local sensor input over swarm network commands. This is a safety protocol. The drones are designed to function individually if network connection is lost. What the safety protocol does not account for is an enemy that knows this response is coming and has prepared for it specifically. The moment the northeast quadrant went independent, Echo Company's engineering element activated the second phase of their preparation. In the drainage channels running under the settlement, the channels that the Grethian thermal sensors had mapped as empty infrastructure. The engineers had spent 11 days installing a pressure-activated acoustic system that I can only describe as a mechanical nightmare. When triggered, it produced a specific frequency combination that interfered with the independent scan mode of a Grethian drone's primary sensor array. The 40 Northeast Quadrant drones went effectively blind. 40 drones, blind, in the middle of a human defensive zone they couldn't navigate independently, are not a tactical asset. They become obstacles. And the 212 soldiers of Echo Company, who had spent 11 days learning exactly what a Grethian drone looks like when it's operating on independent scan in acoustic interference, moved through those 40 units in 90 seconds. Not shooting, not fighting, moving. They tagged the drones with signal marker devices, the exercise equivalent of neutralization, as they moved through them. 40 drones, tagged and removed from the exercise in 90 seconds without firing a single shot. I was gripping the railing of the observation tower. But here's the thing. Here is the thing that I could not process in real time and have spent a great deal of time processing since. The other 560 drones were still functional, still advancing, still networked. And they had observed the Northeast Quadrant failure. Grethian network architecture is adaptive. When a section fails, the swarm reprioritizes resources to compensate. The remaining 560 units recalibrated. They identified the acoustic interference source. They identified the general area from which the signal marking had occurred. They began to close. A competent Grethian force, even a drone force, learns, adapts. That's what makes them effective. That's what makes the Grethian tactical model so consistently accurate. What the Grethian tactical model had never had to account for, because in 300 years of observed Grethian engagements, it had never happened, was an enemy that had anticipated the adaptation. Colonel Castillo, watching from a command station below the observation tower, issued a single command at the 10-minute mark. She said, Phase 3. I need to tell you something about Echo Company's captain. His name was Yusuf Amara, and he was 31 years old, which by human standards is young for a company commander. He was Nigerian-British, which is a cultural specificity I mention because it becomes relevant to something I thought about later. He was not physically imposing. He was medium height, slender in the way that distance runners are slender, with round glasses that seemed out of place in a tactical setting. He had spent his 11 days of preparation, sleeping approximately 4 hours a night. I know this because I had been watching. The soldiers had been preparing their positions across the training complex, and I had observed Captain Amara during 3 of those preparation nights, moving through the settlement in the dark with a tablet and a laser measuring tool, personally checking every position, every channel, every concealment point. Not because he didn't trust his soldiers. Because he couldn't not check, because he was the kind of person who checks things. When Castillo said Phase 3, it was Amara's plan that activated. Phase 3 was, I am going to be precise here, because I know how this sounds. The simultaneous activation of 7 independent tactical systems that Echo Company had spent 11 days building into the terrain of the exercise complex. 7 systems, simultaneously, coordinated by a human-designed signal network that had been laid into the terrain, specifically to operate on frequencies that Grethian drone sensors do not monitor, because Grethian drone sensors were designed by Grethians and Grethians don't use those frequencies. The first system was thermal masking, panels built from materials sourced from the base's own supply chain and redesigned by Echo Company's engineering element that produced false thermal signatures matching a human defensive line approximately 300 meters north of the actual defensive line. The 560 remaining drones received a sensor priority override, a synthetic target, indistinguishable from a real one, pulling 2/3 of the swarm toward an empty field. The second system was a series of directional signal repeaters that fed false positioning data into the Grethian network's self-location protocol. The drones began receiving location information, suggesting they were approximately 40 meters south of their actual position. 40 meters doesn't sound like much. In the middle of a simulated settlement, at night, navigating between structures, 40 meters is the difference between a clear firing lane and a wall. The third through seventh systems I am going to summarize not because they were less remarkable, but because describing all seven in detail would take longer than the exercise itself. They involved acoustic channeling to direct drone movement toward prepared positions, an electromagnetic pulse array disguised as damaged infrastructure, a waterline pressure system repurposed to produce movement simulation in the soil that confused ground sensor arrays, a smoke-and thermal combination that disrupted optical sensors. And this is the one I still think about most, a completely manual communication system using a series of physical signals, light and hand, that allowed Echo Company to coordinate their own movements without generating any electronic signature whatsoever. No electronic signature. 212 soldiers, operating in the dark, in coordinated movement, communicating with light signals and hand signals across a settlement complex, because their commander had realized that any electronic communication could be detected and used for targeting, and had therefore removed electronic communication from the equation entirely. They had gone dark, completely dark, and they could still coordinate. I had never seen that before. The next 12 minutes were, I'm going to use the word again because it keeps being the right word, beautiful. The 560 drones split under Phase 3's influence. 376 of them moved toward the false thermal line. 184 maintained their position and began recalibrating in response to the multiple simultaneous system activations. The 184 recalibrating drones were isolated. And Echo Company moved. Not in a charge, not in a rush, in something that looked from the observation tower, watching the thermal signatures like water finding channels. Like the 212 soldiers had become part of the terrain itself. They moved in the specific gaps between the recalibrating drone's sensor sweeps. They moved in the timing windows between the false positioning data updates when the drone's location certainty was lowest. They moved in groups of 3 and 4, never larger, never presenting a signature large enough to trigger priority targeting. 184 drones. They were tagged and neutralized in 11 minutes and 23 seconds. That left the 376 drones moving toward the thermal decoy line. At the 14-minute mark, they reached it. They found nothing. In a Grethian drone swarm, a priority target failure of that magnitude triggers a full network recalibration sequence. The swarm halts, it reassesses, it rebuilds its situational model from sensor input. The recalibration takes approximately 90 seconds. Echo Company had spent 11 days figuring that out. In 90 seconds, you can move very far if you know exactly where you're going. When the 376 drones completed their recalibration and turned to face the settlement complex, they found themselves surrounded. Not by a defensive line, not by fortified positions, by 212 soldiers who had moved into positions during the recalibration window that placed them within the minimum engagement range of the drone formation, inside the fire suppression perimeter that Grethian doctrine assumes any competent opponent will stay outside of. No competent opponent moves inside minimum engagement range of a Grethian drone formation. Because inside minimum engagement range, the targeting systems require a reconfiguration to avoid mutual destruction scenarios. It's a safety protocol built into the drone architecture. Echo Company had built their entire Phase 3 around that safety protocol. 376 drones, reconfiguring for close engagement targeting. 92 seconds to complete reconfiguration. Echo Company took them in 87. Total exercise time, 22 minutes and 14 seconds. Total simulated casualties for Echo Company, 9. Total drone force neutralized, 608. I am not going to pretend that I was professionally detached when Sergeant Webb handed me a second cup of coffee at the conclusion of the exercise. I was not professionally detached. I was sitting on the floor of the observation tower, which I had apparently done without fully realizing it, with my tablet on my knees and 23 minutes of notes that were less organized than any notes I had taken in 11 years of tactical assessment. Webb sat down next to me. He didn't say anything for a while. He looked out over the training complex, where exercise controllers were moving through the terrain cataloging and recovering the drone units. The sun was beginning to come up first light on Fort Blackridge, the sky going from black to a deep blue that I had no word for in my native language. I started and then stopped. "Yeah," he said. "Captain Amara, how long has he been?" "He wrote his thesis on Grethian network architecture," Webb said. "Before he was commissioned. Spent 2 years on it. He was flagged for this assignment about 6 months ago when the collective's assessment program came up. They assigned him specifically because the drones were going to be Grethian pattern." "Yep." I looked at my notes, 23 minutes of increasingly disordered observations. He built a plan around knowing it would be Grethian drones. He built a plan around the possibility. He didn't know for certain until about 10 days in when the drones arrived for calibration testing. Webb picked up his coffee. The first plan assumed it might be Dreith pattern. He had contingencies for 4 different drone architectures. I stared at him. "He's thorough," Webb said. Colonel Castillo came to the observation tower about 40 minutes after the exercise concluded. The sun was fully up by then. The autumn light was coming across the training complex at a low angle, the way it does in early morning, making everything look cleaner and starker than it is. She stood at the railing and looked out at the terrain, and I noticed, for the first time, because I had been too focused on other things, that she looked tired. Not the tiredness of someone who had stayed up late. The tiredness of someone who carries something heavier than a night's lost sleep. "What will you write in your report?" she asked. I thought about this carefully. 11 years of reports, threat assessments, capability matrices. Recommendations for how the collective should position itself relative to a given civilization's military capacity. "I don't know yet," I said. She turned to look at me. That was an unusual answer from a collective assessor, and she knew it. "I need to think about what I saw," I said. "I need to think about what it means." "What did you see?" she asked. I thought about Captain Amara in the dark with his tablet. I thought about 212 soldiers communicating in light signals. I thought about the specific, terrible precision of a plan that had anticipated not just what the enemy would do, but what the enemy would do in response to what they did in response to what the enemy would do. "I saw a plan that thought further ahead than I thought humans could think," I said. "In tactical assessment, we have models, we have frameworks. We measure a civilization's military capacity along certain dimensions, numbers, technology, coordination, endurance. And humans score very high on several of those dimensions, which is concerning enough on its own. But what I saw this morning was something that isn't in my models." She waited. "Your tactical thinking," I said. It doesn't work the way other civilizations' tactical thinking works. I've watched the Dreith and the Grethians and the Curvath for 11 years, and they all think tactically in a way that follows from how they think in general. Their warfare is an extension of their cognition. But humans," I stopped. "Captain Amara did not build a plan based on how humans think. He built a plan based on how his enemy thinks. He put himself inside the Grethian architecture and found the places where it fails. He did not use human tactical doctrine. He used Grethian tactical doctrine against itself." Castillo was quiet for a moment. "We've always had to do that," she said. "We've almost always been smaller or slower or less advanced. We've had to learn to use what the enemy knows against themselves." "Since when?" She considered. "Since before recorded history, since the first time something bigger than a human tried to eat one." I spent the remainder of my 45 cycles at Fort Blackridge. I observed more exercises. I had long conversations with Captain Amara, who turned out to be exactly as thorough in conversation as he was in tactical planning. Thoughtful, patient, relentlessly curious, and constitutionally incapable of leaving a problem half-examined. He asked me as many questions as I asked him. More, probably. He wanted to know about Grethian network architecture in detail I hadn't shared in the exercise briefings. He wanted to know about Vethi perceptual cognition and how it compared to human cognition. He wanted to know about the Dreith hive mind, not for tactical purposes, but because he was genuinely fascinated by what it would feel like to share consciousness with 2 million other beings. "Strange," I said. "From the outside, anyway." "Do you think they know they're each an individual?" he asked. It was the kind of question that I spent 3 days thinking about and never entirely answered. On my last night at Fort Blackridge, Sergeant Webb drove me to a ridge line about 8 kilometers from the base. Not the exercise ridge. A natural one with a clear view east and the installation's lights behind us. He brought coffee in a thermos. We sat on the hood of the Humvee and drank it, and the night was cold enough that the coffee produced steam. And above us, the sky was enormous and very clear, and I could see stars that I knew the names of from the collective's charts, and stars that I didn't have names for. "Are you going to tell them we're dangerous?" Webb asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded. He had known. "Are you going to tell them how dangerous?" I thought about 22 minutes and 14 seconds. I thought about 7 simultaneous systems built in 11 days. I thought about 212 people going completely dark and still coordinating. "I'm going to try," I said. "I'm not sure I have the right words." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What would you say if you had to use just one?" I looked at the stars. I thought about Captain Amara's thesis, about the drainage channels and the acoustic panels and the 4 contingency plans for 4 different drone architectures, about Colonel Castillo saying, "We've always had to do that." "Adaptable," I said. Webb made that small sound again, not quite a laugh. "That's a good one," he said. We finished the coffee. The night got colder. The trees along the ridgeline, mostly bare now, the autumn having done its work, stood black against the dark sky, and I thought about chlorophyll degradation, and the way the briefing document had described it so clinically, and the way nothing in the briefing document had prepared me for the actual color of it. Some things I was beginning to understand, you simply cannot prepare for. You can make plans. You can build contingencies. You can spend 11 days in the dark with a tablet and a measuring tool, checking every position, closing every gap. And then something comes over the ridge line that you have never seen before, and the plan either holds or it doesn't, and you find out in 22 minutes and 14 seconds who you actually are. I wrote my report on the transport home. It was longer than 37 pages. It was not a threat assessment exactly. Or rather, it was, but not the kind the High Council was expecting. It did not categorize humans on the standard capability matrices. It did not assign a threat level rating. Instead, it said this in the opening paragraph, and I will quote myself exactly. "The fundamental error in all previous assessments of human military capacity is the assumption that human tactical thinking can be modeled. It cannot be modeled because it does not follow a fixed architecture. What we have been measuring is hardware. The question we have not been asking, the question that the assessment program at Fort Blackridge forced me to confront, is what happens when the most adaptable cognition in the observed galaxy turns itself fully toward the problem of defeating you specifically. The answer in my direct observation is this: 600 units, 22 minutes, 9 simulated casualties. I recommend the collective revise its assessment framework immediately. Not because humans are an insurmountable threat, but because our current frameworks were not built to account for an adversary whose primary tactical advantage is that they have already studied the framework. They know how we think. They have known for longer than we realized. And they have been planning accordingly. I still have my notes from the exercise, all 23 disorganized minutes of them. I keep them not because they're professionally useful, they're too chaotic for that, but because they're the most honest record I have of what it felt like to watch something impossible happen in real time. The last note, written in my native script at what my timestamp says was 4:22, says, "Thermal viewer, fall leaves, Captain Amara's glasses, the sky going blue." I did not understand what I was looking at. I understand it better now. Not completely, but better. Sale Doran, Senior Tactical Analyst. Collective Strategic Assessment, Bureau. Filed, Standard Cycle 7, Assessment Year 1194. Recommendation status, urgent, priority routing to High Council. Personal note, not for formal record. Go see the trees in autumn if you ever have the chance. The briefing document does not do it justice.